My next guest is Kurtis Hewson. As a lead learner and co-founder of Jigsaw Learning, Kurtis has championed the call for collaborative structures in schools to ensure success for all students and enhance the collective efficacy of those dedicated educators working in classrooms. Kurtis works to establish responsive relationships with districts and system level leaders to design collaborative frameworks for educators and develop leadership capacity at all levels. He has over 25 years of experience in the classroom, including over a decade as an award winning school administrator. An engaging speaker and facilitator, Kurtis interacts with thousands of educators and educational stakeholders annually to ensure collaborative response is foundational to how schools work together to ensure success for all students. Well, welcome to the podcast, Kurtis.
Oh, thanks, Dana. It's an absolute pleasure to join you and engage in a conversation. Thanks so much.
We'll start off with the question I ask everybody at the beginning. Tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
Yeah, and I love this question. I've been pondering it for a little bit, and I go back to a conversation I've had several times with individuals of reflecting back from a beginning administrator standpoint.
Okay.
And I don't know if you've experienced this in your role as well, Dana, but as a young administrator who, reflecting back, knew nothing, tried to be Superman to everyone. And what
Yeah.
I mean by that is an issue would show up at my door and I'd say, "Oh, no problem. I'll drop everything and let me come fix that for you." And
Yeah.
it was done with the best of intentions, but it put everything onto my back and some of the things, and it led to some early ahas that led right to the work I do today of I do not have the solutions to all answers. In fact, some of the best expertise in our building exists outside. And how can we
Yeah.
leverage those? And in taking everything on, I was not building the capacity of anybody else within the organization or leveraging. So I hit a difficult part early on as an administrator, being in the trenches of just feeling overwhelmed. And that was what led to I have to stop this idea that I can put on a cape and solve everyone's problems. That actually isn't helping anybody, including me. How could we, how could I go about my leadership differently? And then how could we really leverage the expertise that is in this building in a more effective way?
And I think that's something a lot of beginning admin fall into, right? Especially if they're coming into a school where there wasn't a lot of distributive leadership, right? And
Yeah.
they're also maybe coming into a school where they didn't hear a lot from the previous principal or get some of the how to's, right? And they're kind of taking over blindly. So, but yeah, like you said, you went through that process and realized that you did need to distribute leadership and learn like who were the experts on certain things. So I
Yeah,
think
and
that's
I've often said this before in our school where we started this collaborative response work that I do now as my primary work. We had a school with, if you added it up, centuries of teaching experience. Why would we think the expertise
yeah.
exists in one role
Oh
in
yeah.
one office? And how do we leverage the people who like collectively we're smarter than any one individual, so let's leverage it.
Yeah. Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about Jigsaw Learning, just as an organization, the history of the organization, and then when you and your wife decided to go full time with Jigsaw Learning.
Yeah. So it's probably a similar story that you've heard before, Dana, of there was no preconceived notion to engage in any work outside of the school that myself and my wife were in. It really just grew organically. So it was back in the mid 2000s. I was in my third school as an administrator and seeing really good teachers doing great things for kids. And by teachers, I mean any adult that was working with students in our school. And um, we weren't leveraging that collective capacity. Like I said, I reflect back now, and we often refer to it as isolated islands of excellence. Great people doing great things, willing to jump in and help whenever they could, but we didn't have systems to not only ensure that happened, but to give structure for it to happen in a really meaningful way. So as we began to put some pieces in place, some structures, we had people come and ask to see what was happening in the school. I began to get requests out to share what it was looking like. At one point, reached the situation of this conversation I'm having off the side of my desk is kind of starting to become a fairly substantial amount of time and requests that were coming in. And so as we journey along, move towards there's a chance we could be doing this on a more regular basis and helping to support more schools than just my own, more systems than just ours. And from that, what became later known as Jigsaw Learning, which is our um, company that we have, is really about trying to support and impact as many organizations as possible so that we can impact as many positive outcomes for not only students, but for those working closely with the students as well. So that's a little bit of the origin story that never really had a point where, hey, we should start doing this from outside of a school division. It was not the intent.
And I talked a little bit about collaborative response as well.
Yeah.
So, talk to me. You have a book of the same title, but let's first of all talk about what collaborative response is that you all helped schools work towards in terms of the consulting and jigsaw learning.
Yeah, so I'll go back to that school in the mid 2000s. And when people would come in and ask to see what we were doing because someone's sister-in-law had heard about it from someone who was
Yeah.
teaching in our school, um, you'd try and explain all of these different connected pieces, and you could see people's eyes glaze over. Um, it would be really complicated to show all the interconnections that had been built over time, not initially, but to then go back and try and process, well, what would that look in my school was really, really difficult to do. So we had to think of what are the key elements that are fueling the work and essentially develop what would be a framework to capture the big ideas. We initially referred to it as a collaborative response model and started to share the foundational components that I'll get to in a moment. But we found out once we began working with other schools and other systems that calling it a model was actually a little bit difficult to think through. We found out that it's not really a model. Um, it's more of a mindset. It's a way of thinking in our schools for how do we collaboratively respond to the needs of our students so that no student's success or lack thereof is ever the responsibility of a single individual. We create teams. So our collaborative response framework now consists of three foundational components. And we talk about this in the idea of simplexity, simple in design, highly complex when you start connecting the pieces. And I'll share with you to share with your listeners in the show notes some an overview article that we have, but it has a foundational graphic that's three puzzle pieces. The first puzzle piece is collaborative structures and processes, and it's the biggest puzzle piece. It's about how do you create layers of team within your school to be able to leverage the power of the collective expertise in the building, but ensuring that no student can slip through the cracks through the layering of these teams. Our second puzzle piece then is data and evidence. And the idea is once we have these collaborative structures and processes established or the skeleton built, how do we start utilizing data and evidence to inform those conversations? How do we go collecting information about what we're seeing and knowing that's happening for students to help fuel the conversation of who's the data saying that we should be paying attention to, or what are some of the trends or bigger ideas that we need to see? And then the third component, and sorry, I keep using my hands to show these puzzle pieces coming together, is a continuum of supports. And the idea is when we begin to discuss what should we do to support this student or this cohort of students, that we don't want every time to become just a brainstorm or a conversation. In time, we want to be able to identify what are the strategies, the interventions, and the accommodations that we're putting in place that we're seeing success, and then start tiering those supports to say, all right, Dana, in your classroom, school-wide, we have these tier one expectations that we've created that we all agree will put in place in our classroom. Then the next tier is, well, in addition to those, there's some things that you could do if it worked in particular situations. No one's prescribing it, but we're saying here's a number of differentiated strategies that we could be trying before we ever move to tier three, which are supports beyond the classroom. And then tier four, which are supports beyond the school. This is where there's a little bit of difference between our work and that around response to intervention or multi-tiered systems of support. Typically, in those frameworks, they're working off a three-tier model. We work off of four, but it's first, we're tiering the supports, not the kids, and we're
Mhm.
not adding one more tier on top. We're actually taking that universal and making it really clear what are the non-negotiables within that we agree on, not that they're being mandated or forced onto you, but then what are the things that you could be considering. And we find through paying attention to those three foundational components creates a really robust culture of response and support, and that nobody feels alone in the work, and we have a lot of support for each and every student.
Yeah, you told me in the show notes it's a little bit about a blend of the PLCs and the RTI process, and also bridging special ed and general ed.
Yeah, absolutely. And we find in working with schools, we always start with what do you already have in place and what could fit already so that we're not blowing up a school and starting from scratch.
Yeah,
Every school that I've been in the last decade has certain elements that fit into this. They may not, what we often hear from schools is this was the piece that brought it all together. It connected all of these different items. So schools that have engaged in professional learning communities work, in any response to intervention structures, or anything in relation to multi-tiered systems of support or MTSS, when those schools see this, it's almost like light bulbs go off of, oh my goodness, I see a connection. I actually get excited when a school says, but we've been doing PLCs for a long time, where I go, oh, awesome. You are
yeah.
so ready for
Mhm.
how it could enhance the work that you're doing, not replace.
Yeah, I think that's the key point is enhancing what they're already doing and bridging that because there are so many of those MTSS teams and the SPED team and general ed teachers working in PLCs that are they're more in silos
Yeah.
than not, right? And especially I'm thinking about my most recent experience in a middle school, you have each grade level team and there might be students who, they have siblings in other grades, but a lot of the time the teachers don't talk to each other across grades. And, there's just a lot of like information that's like crisscrossing, but not necessarily getting heard by the people who need to know. So
Yeah, and this is exactly was one of the initial. I mean, the school where we started this was a smaller school, probably 350 students at our largest population, and even in that, information was getting lost, unclear communication happening, and we had kids slipping through the cracks, not because of any individual teacher, but because we had a system that wasn't catching it.
so Jigsaw Learning then goes into schools to provide professional development along with working with teams. And you also do webinars. So talk to me a little bit about what some of the professional development might look like in the ways that you support schools.
You bet. So I mentioned before that our framework is simple in design. There's three components that we work on, but highly complex in actualizing and piecing them together. Where schools, their staff and leaders go, oh, I get this. I get how everything fits together, which I think is indicative of anything that has staying power, that it takes time and it's a messy, messy process to put it together. So because of that, we know there's multiple entry points that have workshops and webinars online and resources. Our book walks through the overall framework and structure, but then there's still a lot of organizations that say, can you come in and help us engage in it? And typically, most of that comes now from school districts or jurisdictions where they say, we'd like this consistent framework, a similar way of a common language of talking about students and how we'll respond across all our schools. So we often come in now. In fact, that's the majority of our work in person, is to work primarily with school leaders to start, to help to understand all the structures and systems that have to be in place, and then to help engage those that are closest to the students to understand how do all these pieces fit together? How do our meetings that we're establishing, what are some of the structures and processes to make them as beneficial as possible? And usually in working with a jurisdiction, it's typically 3 years that we're
Okay.
engaging in that. And it's not a day-to-day type work. It's usually we'll come in, work for a day with leadership teams from schools, then come back in 2 months and say, okay, what have you accomplished? What's the next step? And through this, we reach a point of reflecting backwards for schools to be able to say, oh my goodness, I can't believe how far this has come, but we don't try and overload it all at once.
Yeah. And that's definitely, like you said, it's a piece where you're collecting a lot of data. There might be staffing changes from year to year, but keeping that work going over the 3 year process, knowing kind of what that common goal is. Because when principals take over, they usually have that 3 to 5 year plan, right? Or if there's a district leadership shift, right? If you're working with leaders in a district. But like I said, I think the most important piece, like you said, is that common language across either many schools in a district, or if you're working in a region where many schools might be, in the same city, but they're all using different acronyms and things like that.
And this is really key within that work, and we see it have incredible impact. It actually over time starts to shift how the system, a district is responding to needs of students in response to what schools are experiencing. And the interesting thing in this, Dana, is we could have two high schools that are in similar communities that have similar student populations, and yet how they respond to students might be on totally different ends of the
Yeah.
earth. What we're trying to do is, can we have a consistent framework for conversation, even though the specifics and logistics can be contextualized at each um, at each location. So for instance, we talk about in that collaborative structures and processes, every school needs 4 layers of team, but in some schools, a large high school, they may have multiple structures at each one of those layers just because of the size of the building. We've seen other smaller schools where there's only 4 staff in the entire building. They are the team in every conversation, but we still talk about, well, then let's still set 4 layers of conversation that you're establishing. So getting that common language and that common framework is absolutely key. And we see schools where their collaborative cultures just goes to a totally another level through
Yeah.
engaging in this work.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to be said. Like I've worked in larger school systems where it does seem very much everybody to their own, whether within a building or within the school in the district. And I think a lot can be said for bringing in outside consultancies like Jigsaw Learning to kind of help structure that, right? Because you save a lot of time in the long run, like you said. I also wanted to talk with you about your book, which is called Collaborative Response. It came out through Corwin in 2022. So is this kind of just a how-to in terms of what you've been talking about, or are there other things that educators can use within their location?
Yeah, so we see that text as kind of the anchor resource to help explain. In fact, the subtitle is three foundational components that transform how we respond to the needs of learners. So it breaks down those 3 components that I talked about. But then in the book, there's multiple vignettes, little stories that describe what it looks like, a story that'll describe a challenging situation, and then how we can adjust that. We also then have a companion website with a number of templates, resources, videos that go along with it. It's interesting. We often see that book coming into sessions with things dog-eared and notes and tags, because our hope is any leader that reads it can go, okay, I see some of the things that we do already and how it connects, but I also see a next step or a way to align the data and evidence we're collecting, for example, and the meetings that we're having as a response. So yeah, that text becomes really foundational. Like I said, an anchor resource. And then we have the supplementary different workshops and resources that are available online to just continue to
Okay.
go deeper. You mentioned that podcasts. We are our one podcast leading collaborative response is about trying to take some of the concepts from the book, go deeper, be able to explain, last week my wife Lorna and I were in this school. Here's something that we saw, and let's respond or share it out with listeners. We also then bring on school leaders and district leaders as guests to just share how have they implemented the work, what are the lessons that they've learned. It's the work is very much a learning process, not a not something that you get trained on in a one workshop setting.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like you said, having that podcast where people can hear stories of others who have gone through the process, what they've learned in the process, and the collaboration piece. Especially if they're just starting out in the process or just new leaders in general. Like you said in your trench story, who might want to look more into collaborative, um, you know, uh, decision making and distributive leadership. So how often is a podcast published, and how many episodes do you have so far?
So we publish every week, and I think we're on episode 53 right now, so still
Okay.
pretty much in its infancy. Um, but we also then have a secondary podcast that's on building a culture of collaboration, and it's not
Okay.
directly connected to collaborative response, but it comes out every 2 weeks. The reason we started that podcast is when we're engaging in collaborative response work, there's some basic fundamental principles of leadership and of bringing teams together that are important to understand. So that other podcast is intended, even if you're not engaging in this collaborative response work, we try and engage with different thought leaders around what have you learned about effective teams and building strong meeting structures and those kind of things. And that one's been interesting, Dana, and I'm sure you've had this in your podcast, the chance to talk with people in other situations, other contexts. We've even gone into other industries. It's such rich learning to be able to bring back and go, okay, well, here's a business leader and how they set up teams within their organization. There's some interesting thoughts we could bring back to our educational realm.
Yeah, I think that's also a great opportunity to hear, and also like I've done a lot of reading about leadership and other industries as well. So a lot of that can transfer over to what people are doing within schools. In the pre-chat, we talked a little bit about some of the meetups that you have with some of the people that schools that you've collaborated with. So you said you used to do conferences in Edmonton, but now recently it's become more of a retreat setting. So talk to me a little bit about what you might have planned for the spring or summer.
Yeah, you bet. So we are, as you noted there, located in the province of Alberta in Canada. So right above Montana, our capital city is Edmonton. And when we first began this work, of course, it started to populate within our own geographic area. So a number of years ago, I think it was probably 8 now, we were struck with the idea that we have so many different schools and leaders and educators engaging in this work. How could we bring them together to learn from one another? I mean, it's one thing to read a book or sit in a workshop, but to actually get to a table with somebody that says, we're struggling with this, or when we implemented, here's something that we learned around this. So we started off as a conference, and it was a fairly big event that was at a convention center. I think at our highest we might have had um, 600 participants at it. But what we were finding through that is we were losing some of the connections and networking that we really wanted to install. That we would have people that would come, sit in a session, and then sit quietly at the back and and then take off, maybe not even be at the venue for lunch. And we were trying to get to a place of, oh, how could we make this so much more value added? And so we moved 3 years ago to a retreat format. It happens every year at the beginning of May in the community of Lacombe, Alberta, which is where we're located now. It's fairly central population-wise within Alberta. And the intent is we cap the numbers at 140, and we all of our presenters are school and district leaders that are engaging in this work. They share their stories, their successes, their challenges, what they've done, and people learn from one another. But we set up the retreat format. So it's very much when you come, we start in a reflection exercise. You determine where you think you're at. What are some of your next steps that you hope to achieve over the next 2 days? And then we work through a process of achieving those through attending sessions, through interacting in some different meeting structures that we have. It's been a really unique format and we absolutely love it. Plus, it creates that smaller community of people that are invested not only in their own schools, but in one another as well.
And you tend to have that in the summertime?
It happens in May, so beginning of
Okay.
May each year.
Hmm. So people can check out your website for more information about that. Um, I think we've had a great conversation today around just collaborative response, your experience as a principal and starting Jigsaw Learning and then going full time with it to help support the effort in schools. Out of everything we've talked about, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
I think it comes back to what we've said as an underlying mantra of this work. We believe every child deserves a team. And I don't know if you've seen the TEDx talk by um, a lady by the name of Rita Pearson. I love that it talks about every child deserves a champion. And it's a beautiful message that she puts out. But we've talked and had reflection around that I think in our education system, trying to ensure that every child has a champion has, of course, inspirational messages behind it, but I also worry about it being a recipe for burnout, meaning that I individually have to be a champion for each. We believe through this work that actually, if we could put those champions into team situations, man, we can exponentially expand the power of that team, which is going to impact more and more students. So the thing that I would love people to walk away is the idea of every child deserves a team, and how do we structure our schools to be able to do that? And not by meaning if I have a school of 1,000 that I need 1,000 teams for each child. No, we accomplish it through really, really intentional and purposeful structures within the school. And then I would encourage to check out the website jigsawlearning.ca, and that is the launch off to a number of different things. There's an overview of collaborative response video that's there, an article to be able to just start to get a basic understanding. I think that would be the key message to be able to leave with is ensuring every child benefits from strongly intentional and impactful teams.
Yeah, and I'll insert the link to that YouTube video or the TEDx that you mentioned, and I'll also put in the show notes. You're on social, you have a YouTube channel, and the website as well. Well, thank you so much for being my guest on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. It was a pleasure learning more about your work and how you can work with schools and districts to have more collaborative teams to enhance student learning.
Yeah, and Dana, I'm really excited because you're going to jump onto our podcast and talk about what you see as effective principles in place when teachers' collaboration is maximized. So, looking forward to that follow-up conversation as well.
Thank you.